you, Lori. Hi, everybody. I should probably start by saying good morning, Baltimore. So, first of all, I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm really excited to see the show. So, practice well, rehearse, get ready, because I'll be in the audience. So I want to tell you a little bit about me in terms of what Lori just said, and then what I want to do with you for a little bit tonight. We have, what, 20 minutes, 30 minutes? You tell me what we have.
You take as long as you need.
As long as we need. Oh, get ready, relax. So as Lori said, I lived in Baltimore for 13 years. I moved there because there was a synagogue that I was chosen to be the rabbi of. I'm not from Baltimore. I'm actually from Los Angeles, so going to Baltimore was a very new and different experience for me. Are any of you from Baltimore or from East Coast cities? Where from?
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, okay.
Boston.
Boston, good cities.
Connecticut.
Connecticut, okay. So, go ahead, I saw it, go ahead.
New York.
New York. That's a small little city, right? So one of the things that I noticed very differently when I moved to Baltimore was that people lived in ethnic neighborhoods, still to this day. So I was the rabbi of a synagogue, and I lived in a community in which 90,000 Jews of the 100,000 Jewish people that were counted in Baltimore lived in a 3-mile radius of my synagogue. There was like a Jewish neighborhood. I grew up in Los Angeles. There were neighborhoods where people lived and you knew a little bit maybe here or there, but it was a much more integrated kind of a community. And I came to learn that that's really the history of Baltimore. Baltimore as a city has always been divided and segregated along ethnic and racial lines, and even attempts to integrate that, people self-selected to stay together in their communities. So I lived in the Jewish community. I knew where the Catholic community was. I knew where the Italian community was. I knew where the African American community was. And yes, there were people who lived in all these different communities who didn't fit the label, but the community, very differently than what we're used to here in San Diego, is really kind of a community where you live among the people you're the most familiar with or who are the most like you. So I want you to know that because that's going to help you understand a little bit about the background. I want to do two things with this evening. I want to tell you a little bit about the background of the show you're doing in terms of how it comes out of the city of Baltimore, a couple of things I learned about Baltimore, and then I want to find out of that conversation something about a value for all of us that we can hold to and live to and hope that we're actually helping to promote by performing Hairspray. Because you may or may not know it, but the original, I want to get the facts here as I brought a couple of the facts. I don't remember everything anymore the way I would like to. The original screenplay was translated into a movie. The original story was translated into a movie by a nice Jewish guy. And he had a vision. Now, the original show Hairspray was written by a man named John Waters. Have you seen the original? Have you guys seen the original back? Right? Okay? A couple of interesting things about John Waters. Do you know anything about John Waters? John Waters is today still an author and a producer. John Waters likes to explore the alternative in life, that which is a little different. And one of the more controversial films he made back when was where he cast somebody who was a transgender man into the role of a woman. Who was playing Edna? Why is that role always cast as a man playing a woman? So everybody assumed it was done because that was John Waters' agenda to show the different in society. And it turns out when he was interviewed, he said, really, that wasn't my agenda this time at all. What I was trying to do was give the show an edge and a little spice that somebody would actually have to play out a character in a way that wasn't natural to them. Are you doing that? Okay, so the show, you all know the story of the show, obviously. So who's playing Corny Collins? Is that his name, right? Can you sing and dance really well?
Yes.
Do you know the background of that show? That was a real show. There's a real story.
The Buddy Dean show?
The Buddy Dean show. What do you know about the Buddy Dean show?
It was canceled because they couldn't integrate.
So there's the flip right there. The Buddy Dean show was the precursor to American Bandstand. Dick Clark? Some of you remember Dick Clark.
Well, who are you looking at?
Yeah. Okay. And they wanted, actually, the producers of the show wanted to integrate the dancing. We're going to talk in a minute about the separation and the racism. They wanted to integrate the dancing. In the play you're doing, it's the producers who don't want to integrate, and it's Tracy and her friends who come along and protest the segregation. In the real story, it was the exact opposite. They wanted the network to change it and to integrate the dancing, and the community wouldn't do it. And I want to read you one quote, and this is from Buddy Dean, who, by the way, died in 2003. He said, "The management of the station did not realize that Baltimore was very much a southern-oriented city. They asked each kid on the show's committee of regular dancers what they thought about integration. And the kid said, 'It's okay with me, but my folks won't accept it.' And that was the general consensus, so they canceled the show." So what does Hairspray come along and tell us? We actually can make this change. We actually can integrate. We actually can make a difference. It's the opposite of what actually happened. Buddy Dean packed up and moved to Arkansas because the show got canceled. So let me help you a little bit with the cultural background in terms of race in Baltimore.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I'm okay. Baltimore was the first American city to prohibit blacks from moving into white neighborhoods. There's a claim to fame. Was the first city that said, if you're black, you can't live where whites live. Right? And this took root in a community and created very separate neighborhoods. Now, the show that you're doing, Hairspray, takes place in what is called in Baltimore, East Baltimore. It doesn't matter, we don't have to show you maps or anything, we're not in Baltimore. But that East Baltimore community today is the most impoverished, the least served, the most segregated, the most difficult community, because everybody who was Tracy left. To me, and I remember a rabbi in Baltimore, the saddest part of learning about the history of racism and segregation in Baltimore was learning that it was actually aimed at the Jews. Actually aimed at the Jews. There was a very important study done about the neighborhoods of Baltimore called Not in My Neighborhood, How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City. I mean, there's a legacy for you. How bigotry shaped a great American city. And for any of my friends watching on the videotape in Baltimore, I love you. I had a great time there. There's lots of wonderful good things there. There's beautiful history there. There's beautiful culture there. But there's this stigma. How bigotry shaped a great American city. And here's how the bigotry began. Why did they want to prohibit blacks from moving into white neighborhoods? Because they wanted to make sure Jews wouldn't move into those neighborhoods either. What's the connection? Do you know the sociology in America? The typical connection in neighborhoods is that when you have ethnic groups, religious groups moving, as one group is socioeconomically more successful and moves on to a new neighborhood, the next more lower class or middle class community starts moving up the economic ladder. So who followed the nice white folks living in the nice areas in Baltimore? The Jews who were immigrants Jews started immigrating to Baltimore in the early 1800s, and as the immigrants were starting to earn a little money and settle down and establish a community, they wanted to start moving into these neighborhoods. And so laws were passed preventing blacks from moving into the neighborhoods because Jews would typically sell their houses to the next economic group coming up the ladder, which was often the other kind of ethnic minorities. So if you can't sell to Jews, Jews can't sell to blacks, but we don't want to say we're anti-Semitic, so we're going to say we're anti-black. That's more socially acceptable. Isn't that crazy? There were even some Jewish real estate developers who agreed not to let Jews buy their properties, prejudiced against their own so that they could do successful business in the larger community. How racism shaped the city. So today, if you go to Baltimore today, I encourage you to do so. It's a beautiful city. Lots of fun things to do. You know the good things that happened in Baltimore? America was saved in Baltimore. The War of 1812 was won in Baltimore. And Francis Scott Key wrote a very famous song. We call it the national anthem. And you can go to the museums and see all of this really great stuff. And the Chesapeake Bay is beautiful. And the buildings and the architecture. Today it's a really vibrant city. But there's this piece in Baltimore that Hairspray tries to pull out of how the vestiges of segregation have stayed in place. They've stayed in place. So in 1964, there was a huge riot. In 1968 in America, there were riots in many major cities after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. But in 1964, there were riots in the Jewish neighborhoods of Baltimore, because by the way, there were neighborhoods where Jews weren't allowed to live either. There were riots and you know why there were riots? There were riots by African Americans. You know why there were riots? They were envious of the newer neighborhoods being built for Jews in segregated areas, but not for them. So there was envy between the groups. Really difficult. So Laura, you were very nice in introducing me, and you said that I had done some work with this. So let me tell you my entree into this, make this modern, and we'll try to find a lesson here. So some of you have heard of the sad loss of a gentleman named Freddie Gray. Did you hear about this story a few years back? Freddie Gray was an African-American who the police accosted and arrested for some kind of a crime, and they threw him into a van, and they drove him rough around the city. 7 different officers were involved in the transfer of this man who was arrested to the Central Baltimore jail, and in the course of arresting him, he died. And these 7 officers were accused of his murder by not seating him properly in the car, by riding in ways that made him go up and down, his neck broke, this happened, and it was assumed that these 7 officers intentionally killed this guy. Trust me when I tell you this was not a good moment in the city. There were riots in the streets, there were protests, right? And after it calmed down, all 7 officers went on trial, and the first 5 of the trials ended in mistrials. The prosecutors couldn't bring enough evidence and get a jury to convict, so they didn't even prosecute the last 2. These 7 guys, whether they were guilty or not, honestly, I'm not one to say, but there was nobody who was held accountable in any kind of social way for the death of this guy, Freddie Gray. And that's where I enter the story. All sorts of people started talking about how are we going to build relationships? How are we going to heal communities? How are we going to get to know in our community the circumstances in your community, and in your community the circumstances in our community? How are we going to build some bridges to overcome these kinds of distances and fears? And so me and my congregation got involved with a wonderful gentleman who had an African-American church 2 blocks away from where the Freddie Gray incident took place. And we began introducing teenagers to each other, and we began finding things that people could do together. We did some study together. I went to Easter Mass and made a presentation to the church. They came to our Passover service and made a presentation to us. We started building connections, and you know what we discovered? We wanted the same things in life. We had the same dreams for our children in life, but here was the difference. Around me and my community, the infrastructure existed to accomplish it, and around him and his community, it did not. It did not. It wasn't safe to go outside. There wasn't a warm coat for the winter. He and his church built a basement where he had computers because none of the kids who went to his church in school or at home had access to a computer. How do you not function here? You guys want to not go online? How are you going to function today? But these are folks who didn't have access to everything you and I take for granted. So we started imagining with lots of other people how we could build projects to help create those resources in those communities. And he wanted his students to know my students because he wanted his students to imagine a different future. And I wanted my students to know his students so that they could imagine a different society. And I'm not there anymore, but my understanding is, as I talk to people, that project continues and those relationships are building and there's much to be done. So we just celebrated the holiday of Passover. What's the big event of Passover? No, yeah, the food. But what's the big story? Yeah, we're over the food now. We can have big. What's the big news in the story?
It's the story of freedom.
Freedom. And how does that freedom happen? What's the big moment? If you're making a movie, what's the big moment? The Exodus. And what's the central moment to the Exodus? The parting of the Red Sea. Wow! There's a scene. Right? So listen to what happens. Big miracle. The sea parts. The former slaves, the children of Israel, walk through the sea to their freedom. The sea closes back up. They turn around, they see they're free, they see nobody is chasing them, they start walking in the wilderness because they're going to a new land. They're going to build a new society. They're not going to be where there's oppression and prejudice and hatred. They're going somewhere new. And after they've been walking 3 days, you know what happened? They got hungry. I'd be hungry after a 3-day hike in the desert. They got hungry. So you know what they said to Moses? Take us back. There's no food out here. We don't die out here in the wilderness. Take us back. We would rather be slaves than hungry and free in the wilderness. The very famous rabbi named Abraham Joshua Heschel, he looks at this scene and he says, you and I don't know how to pay attention. We all think the Red Sea was the big deal. That wasn't the big deal. We all think God cared about the freedom and the redemption and all the big stuff. That's not it. How does the story continue? God provides them food. It's called manna. It's the story in the Torah. Provides them food to eat in the wilderness. And Abraham Joshua Heschel goes on to say, here's what God cares about. God cares about your security and your ability to eat and your ability every day to feel safe. He says, that's what God cares about. He says, God didn't give us freedom so we could have a big miracle story and ignore what it is every day to take care of each other. God gave us freedom in order to see in another person the very same needs we see and have for ourselves. I actually think that's what Hairspray is saying to us. I've seen the Broadway show. I've seen the movie many times. I've seen John Waters' original movie. I've read some of the history. I've met people who actually know this story. We have somebody visiting at the synagogue now. His name is David. Okay, his father danced on the Buddy Keene show. So I know people who know the truth of this story. And I think it has something really powerful to say. When you see an injustice, work to correct it. When you see something that's unequal or not right, do something about it. Don't assume about your circumstance that somebody else's circumstance doesn't also require your attention. And I actually think that's the heroism in the story. Who's playing Tracy? That's what her character is all about. Tracy and John Waters had no idea about who Rabbi Heschel was. Okay? But I think Rabbi Heschel's lesson is actually the moral of the story. Right? That you see something that isn't okay, and you see people who have the same needs and yearnings as you, and you shouldn't be separate, and you shouldn't be isolated, and you shouldn't be strangers. And yes, you will meet people who don't get it. You will meet people who aren't ready for it. You will meet people who want to hold the line on what's been their comfort. And your response to them has to be caring, respect, and change. And I really think that's why this is a great show. I mean, it's a fun show, and the music's fun, and dancing's fun, the story's fun. But I actually think that's why this show has had some success. John Waters' original movie was moderately, it wasn't such a big hit. The Broadway show was huge, and the John Travolta movie, or however you want to describe it, was a huge commercial success. And as much as it's fun, and the music is good, and the dancing is good, and the talent is good, and you're all going to do a great job, I also think it's saying something that actually people want to hear. And I would argue that people need to hear. The fundamental problem, in my view, in our world today is two things. And Hairspray addresses both of them. The lack of a secure infrastructure for all people to live their lives securely. It's just every city we know really is not providing safe, secure, nourishing places for all people. And we have to figure out a solution to that. And secondly, that contributes to what became Baltimore's problem, which is when you live in the lesser place, people look at you as if you are less. We're all the same. And we have to see each other as all being the same. Inequality comes from lack of infrastructure. And the solution to that is not only social integration, but really figuring out how to provide for everybody that foundation for living a life where we can see each other in the same ways that we are. And that, whether you knew it or not when you signed up to be in Hairspray, is my takeaway as what's really going on in the story. And I say that not only because I think that's present in the script and the narrative, but because knowing something of Baltimore and the people in Baltimore and the background and the history of the city of Baltimore and its segregation and its racism, I think when John Waters was writing this play, originally the movie, I think he was trying to help people see something different. And to go back to the beginning, that's why even though the Buddy Keene show was canceled because they couldn't overcome the segregation in the movie and in your play, Tracy and friends win, and the segregation is gone. And I think that was his vision. So I hope that's helpful to you as you prepare and rehearse and look forward to a great time.